I could feel very high.
It's a new day on the Enterprise, and a rather special one. This is the first-year anniversary of T'Pol joining the crew, so we're getting sloshed. The passing of a year means a crew evaluation, which should be pretty positive given that T'Pol saved the entire series in the last episode, but it gave Archer a reason to look through her record again. One thing sticks out during her time on Earth. She took a visit to a town in Pennsylvania, the titular Carbon Creek, and Archer's curious why. He drops it when she says it's personal, though Tucker thinks it's unfair for her to not share the story, given how many times they've bored the shit out of her with theirs. This desire for a story seems to convince her, so she tells them about the first contact between humans and Vulcans, the one that happened before the official one with Zephram Cochrane, the one that happened with T'Pol's great-grandmother at the town of Carbon Creek. Today's story proper begins, and we find ourselves in a Vulcan ship, one that decided to pop over to Earth to have a look because we just launched Sputnik, our first artificial satellite, making it sometime after the 4th of October 1957, by the way, so you don't have to go and search for it. The survey mission becomes somewhat more hands-on when they plough their ship into our planet. The captain doing a dead in the process leaves T'Pol's ancestor Tamir in charge, and in a very happy coincidence for the casting budget, she bears a striking resemblance to her great-granddaughter. Archer breaks in at this point to ask why this was kept secret from we humans, only to be told the Vulcans documented it fully. Okay, those documents are back on Vulcan, and they probably weren't too vocal about it, but still. Back we go again, and we're now a little over a week after the crash. The food has gone, and faced with the prospect of having to eat meat, one of the trio, called Mistral, thinks exploring the nearest town would be preferable. He's so convinced that he ignores Tamir when she says no and buggers off, forcing her to go after him and leave the third with the ship. A little exploration leads to a little stealing clothes for blending in, and a little blending in leads to a local watering hole with the promise of food. Food requires money, though, and the complimentary pretzels and water aren't exactly a balanced diet. Gambling over pool would be an option if we had any money to wager. Luckily, one of the patrons is an arsehole who offers to gamble in exchange for a drink with Tamir if he wins. Mistral accepts on her behalf because this is the 50s, so he's blending in by talking over her. When he points out the alternative is either starvation or meat, she abandons her objections. Mistral's confidence in victory was clearly deserved, as we're shortly leaving a shop with 2 filled bags. Having food might have solved their immediate concern, but Mistral's willingness to socialize with all and sundry might have left Tamir wondering if they've just swapped one problem for another. Back on the Enterprise, Tucker's calling bullshit. T'Pol trying to leave without finishing the story makes Archer intervene and ask for the end, so into the past we go once more. Gambling is not a long-term solution, at least not in a small town where people talk anyway, so the Vulcans take jobs while awaiting rescue. As time goes on, it seems increasingly likely their distress call was not received. Mistral adapts well at least, perhaps a little too well, as he spends time socializing in the bar we found. The owner's getting along with him, and so is her son. Mistral takes an interest here too, as the kid wants to study mechanical engineering. That's not cheap, despite a partial scholarship, so the bar's patrons have been chipping in to help. This whole situation does not sit well with Tamir, who believes humanity is likely going to nuke itself silly before too long. Mistral disagrees and has a more generous view of our species, whilst also saying Vulcans did much the same to themselves centuries ago. The conversation becomes about as heated as it can do when it's between Vulcans, and Mistral leaves with the excuse of fetching a part from the crashed ship for better TV reception. His excuse was just that. Tamir follows him and finds him climbing into the car of the bar owner on a clearly pre-arranged meeting. The meeting was for a sports ball game of some sort based on their conversation as they return, and the bar owner invites him on another date. Trying to mash faces with him doesn't get quite the response she wanted, but he's not entirely against the idea. Tamir is, though, as she's watching them both, and is spotted in turn. Mistral makes his excuses and leaves, the inevitable ding-dong between he and Tamir not taking long. She orders him to leave the woman alone, but he's not buying it. The chain of command was something that died with their ship, and he's ready to start building a life here rather than spend the rest of his days waiting for rescue that simply isn't coming. Tamir is closing up the bar when she decides she needs to meditate, possibly because of just how shite things are going. The bar owner's son arrives and apologizes for the interruption, then surprises her by knowing a little about meditation. He's a reader, you see, curious about a variety of topics, and learning that one of them is astronomy gives the pair something in common. Her making bonds is a contrast to Mistral cooling his off. He's been avoiding social situations, at least according to the pool guy he's working with in the local mine. This conversation takes somewhat of a backseat when there's an explosion and everybody scarpers. Mistral's called the other Vulcans to the shipwreck shortly afterwards as he's looking for a gun and wants help. There are trapped miners and rescue could take days, so he's going to poop his way through the rock to save them. Both Tamir and the unimportant one think this is a shit plan, but Mistral doesn't care. He's not going to let the people he knows die. He's back in the mine and trying to find a place to start his tunnel when his phone rings. It would appear Tamir decided to help after all, and she's providing directions from a scanner outside. Maybe the appeal for altruism changed her mind, or maybe she's realized that if Mistral fails and dies, the humans will find his body. A subsequent post-mortem would be bad for all of them. Regardless of the why, her instructions soon help him to locate and free the trapped miners. This, according to T'Pol back at the dinner table, made Mistral rather popular in town. If anybody wondered how he managed it, they let it go with whatever bullshit excuse he provided. Life returns to normal and 3 months pass. They're all in the apartment they share when the unexpected call from a rescue ship comes, the one they'd concluded wouldn't happen. It'll arrive in 3 days, so that's how long they have to wrap up their affairs, perhaps literally in the case of Mistral. That's not so difficult for two of them, though the bar owner's son wants to say goodbye to Tamir when he hears about it. It's a double stroke of bad news for him, as he's failed to raise the rest of his college money, so he won't be going. Tamir's decided this is proper bullshit, so she's sticking her oar in. A visit to a besooted wanker with a simple and, more importantly, harmless invention of hook and loop fasteners lands her with a thick wedge of cash, which the bar owner is surprised to find in the donations jar the following morning. A wee bit of the old rule-breaking is not limited to Tamir. Mistral's decided he's going to stay here on Earth. Not to get jiggy with the bar owner, as Tamir suggests, but because humanity is about to either do great things or completely fuck itself, and he's got the chance to see it up close. An offer from Tamir to put him on the next survey ship coming this way is not enough. And so, a little later, Tamir and the inconsequential third meet their rescuer. He asks about the captain and their fourth crew member, and Tamir says both were killed in the crash and cremated. Whether Tamir let Mistral go or simply murderized him and burned the body is left open to interpretation. Dinner is over, and some slightly inebriated humans are agog at what they've been told. When Tucker asks if this was all genuine, T'Pol responds that she was asked to tell a story, which is neither confirmation nor denial, you'll note. Tucker takes it to mean the whole thing was bollocks, and T'Pol mentions she also visited a couple of places of geographical interest when asked about Carbon Creek. That doesn't explain why she'd choose a podunk shithole with a coal mine when the other examples are far more impressive, but Archer lets it go, so we will too. Back in her quarters, she takes an item from storage, and we viewers discover it's a bag that looks distinctly like the one Tamir was carrying from today's story, so we'll leave T'Pol to fondle either a very well-preserved 200-year-old Earth handbag or something entirely unconnected as we get ready to take another step on the long road. It can be odd reviewing shows that are old enough to already have an established record of how they were received by viewers. Sometimes I'm able to find value in stories most people consider stinkers, such as Threshold from Voyager being the episode where Tom Paris finally clicked with me. It also provided the first glimmer of an idea that would become the Shit Parent Support Group, something that's now a staple of the channel. On other occasions, though, I watch episodes that are highly reviewed, and I find myself struggling to understand why. Today's story is just such an example. I don't say that to yuck on anybody's yums, and I'm genuinely glad when people find joy in things that didn't quite gel with me. To be clear, I don't think it's bad, and I certainly wouldn't call it a stinker, but whatever component in it that everybody else took to seems to have passed me by. More frustrating is that I struggle to put my finger on exactly why. It's not due to a particular dislike of frame stories, for example, those which spend the majority of their runtime in extended flashbacks. I have no issue with the premise of shipwrecked Vulcans exploring human culture, or of that being told via a tale from T'Pol. I don't even mind the story being of questionable veracity, though some of those plot points raised a few issues for immersion, and we'll get to that in a moment. After pondering it for a while, I think the issue might be that, even if all of this is true, it just doesn't really matter. The story makes no difference to the past or the future either way, so there's no lasting impact save for some questions about the personality of T'Pol. I'd argue that's a good enough reason for the story to exist on its own, and I'm always in favour of a little character exploration, but it's hardly the sort of revelation I'd expect to be attached to high ratings. I mentioned some elements that harmed my feeling of immersion, so let's have a closer look at them to explain why. First off, we have another example of Enterprise doing the weird titillation thing again. The inclusion of shadow puppet Norks when Tamir's stealing clothes adds nothing, a choice made purely to sexualize Jolene yet again. If you can't see the problem with this, imagine switching Tamir with Mistral, and ask yourself if they'd have included the shadow of his dangus. I struggled with a couple of other bits too, though plot-related this time. First is one of geography. Mistral and Maggie, the bar owner, drive over to Doylestown for a baseball game. Let's ignore for a moment the fact that baseball season, which generally runs March to September, was over by this point, excepting the World Series, but they're not playing those games in Doylestown. We know the season was over, by the way, because Sputnik was still broadcasting when the Vulcans arrived, so that could only have been between the 4th of October, when it was launched, and the 26th, when its batteries died. As I said, though, let's ignore that. Let's say Doylestown was literally the only place in America playing baseball on that day. Let's instead focus on the fact that Carbon Creek is on Route 138, according to this sign, which places it somewhere along this line, a little north of Pittsburgh. Doylestown, on the other hand, is here, on the other side of the state, around 300 miles away. That's a 5-hour drive today, so prophets only know what it would have been on 50s roads in a Hudson Super 6. The probable real reason for this error, by the way, is that somebody mistook the fictional Carbon Creek for the real Carbon County, which is about 60 miles north of Doylestown. This is what happens when your fiction isn't sufficiently fictional. I confess I struggle with a more significant plot point too. Tamir and the others are resigned to not being rescued, and that feels off for what we know about Vulcans. The idea that the Vulcan High Command would simply dismiss the disappearance of one of their ships to ignore a potential threat seems unlikely to me. Even if they had reason to conclude there was no threat, I can't see them just writing off the tech in their ship, especially in the vicinity of a planet right on the cusp of spaceflight. No, the idea that nobody would come looking for them regardless of a distress call just doesn't sit right with me. Now, I know what some of you are going to say for those two plot points. You'll argue that T'Pol falls into the category of unreliable narrator, and they may simply be embellishments. That's assuming any of this is real, of course, which we'll come to in a minute. The problem with them being embellishments is that neither of them makes any sense. The first requires her to know geography in sufficient detail to make something up, but not know the general distances involved. It also requires her audience, both American, to not know either. The second requires her to argue Vulcan nature with people who know them a lot better than I do. Even I find the idea off, and I'm not somebody who grew up with a general opinion that Vulcans prefer to keep their secrets, an attitude we know both Archer and Tucker have. In short, neither of those points work as either fact or fiction. Let's touch on that question of fact or fiction, shall we? The reveal of a bag at the end of the episode heavily implies at least part of the story T'Pol told was true. Or does it? We viewers only recognize that bag from a flashback based on the unreliable narration of T'Pol herself. What we saw was the story she was telling, not a display of objective fact. For all we know, the bag could just as easily be one that she personally bought during her time on Earth, which would make rather more sense than her carting around a 200-year-old family heirloom everywhere she goes when you think about it. Would you take your Nan's secret treasures on an experimental exploration flight, especially especially when it's one you didn't expect to remain on for longer than the initial mission. Maybe she was just having a look at the bag which prompted her to make up a massive lie, something at which Vulcans are not particularly adept, and wonder just what effect being around these humans is having on her. Ultimately, as I said near the start, even if this is true, it doesn't really matter, and that serves to dull any feeling of importance. It offers something to think about in terms of retconning first contact with Zephram Cochrane, and has us asking if the coincidence of a passing Vulcan survey ship was really a coincidence at all, but that doesn't change anything tangible in universe. It gives us an example of Vulcans not being the pure logic machines they're sometimes stereotyped to be, but that's hardly novel either. We have plenty of examples in Trek of this, and already a few in Enterprise itself. The episode only has any lasting impact in relation to the personality of T'Pol. We already knew she wasn't quite like other Vulcans, as evidenced by some of her behavior, and the fact she's still here a year later. That difference is further reinforced here, regardless of whether the story was true or false. If it was false, then we've learned she's comfortable enough with being around humans to engage in a bit of the old bullshitting purely for entertainment, a distinctly un-Vulcan attitude. If, on the other hand, it was true, then we've learned that a more nuanced view of our species is something of a family tradition for her. That historic connection may also go a fair way to explaining why T'Pol was willing to judge us on our own merits to begin with. Reading all of this back, a lot of the above sounds vaguely uncharitable, as though I've been trying to find things wrong with it. If I'm being completely honest, there might be a grain of truth in that, as I'll admit part of my objectivity was clouded by knowing my conclusion was not the same as most. To reiterate, I do not think it was bad. I'd even call it good. I'm just not seeing the same vein of excellence that many others did, and that put me in the frame of mind to try and understand why. Any ill feeling you may have at me being unfavourable to one of your favourites should perhaps be viewed through this lens. End of episode.
Have we figured out what we're doing for this season's story arc yet?
Hey, I like that plan.
What plan?
He said we should sort out a translator so we can understand him.
That's a pretty clever... No, wait, hold on a minute. How did you know that's what he said if we need a translator?
Actually, I think you'll find I said in the last credit skit that we were leaving it nebulous. It was, yeah.
But that means... Oh, fuck it. I don't care anymore.
You'll get used to it. Anyway, how do we make a translator then?
I guess we have a word with Hoshi.
The one you said you were going to teach how to talk dog last season, thus raising wider questions about just what languages we do and do not understand.
That's the one, yes.
Well, I'm glad we cleared that up. Oof.